Okay, thank you so much. Good afternoon, and thanks for being with us today. My name is Viviana Herrera, and I'm the Latin American Program Coordinator at MiningWatch Canada. I work with communities struggling to protect their water, environment, and a way of life from Canadian mining companies in Latin America. We do advocacy work with Canadian authorities for corporate accountability in solidarity with affected communities, making sure that these cases are brought to the attention of the Canadian public. I'm accompanied today by the delegation from Mexico and Canadian allies. First, we have José Luis Abarca, who is coming from Chicomuselo, Chiapas. He's the son of Mariano Abarca, who was a community leader in Chicomuselo and was murdered in November 2009. We are also accompanied by Leah Gardner, a lawyer with the Justice and Corporate Accountability Project, JCAP. Next, we also have Esperanza Salazar from the Mexican network of people affected by mining. And lastly, we're accompanied by Salvador Herencia, the Human Rights Clinic Director at the Human Rights Research and Education Center at the University of Ottawa. The Mexican delegation, spearheaded by José Luis, was here in Ottawa in 2018 to look and seeking for justice for the murder of his father, Mariano Abarca. However, earlier this year, justice was denied. This delegation from Mexico is coming to Ottawa again this week with a very specific objective in mind, which has been to bring a complaint to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights against Canada. The complaint alleges that Canada failed to uphold its international human rights obligations when the Canadian embassy in Mexico City pressured Mexican authorities to advance a Canadian mining project despite having knowledge about related threats to Mariano's life. Mariano Abarca was a leader in the social movement opposing the Payback Barite mine, owned by Canadian mining company Blackfire Exploration. And like many other environment leaders around the globe, he faced threats and intimidation for speaking out about human rights violations and environmental harm tied to Canadian mining projects. In 2009, Mariano was killed with impunity for his work denouncing human and environmental abuses connected to Canadian mining. This complaint illustrates once again how Canada supports and prioritizes the mining industry interests over the interest and rights of human rights and indigenous defenders. This complaint also is the latest attempt by the family of Mariano Abarca and its supporters in their 14 years fight to seek information and justice for Mariano's murder in Canada. It is also a call for Canadians about the human rights impacts of Canadian mining and the Canadians' diplomatic support for Canadian extractive industries abroad. But I'm gonna leave it here, and I want you to hear more about all of this now from José Luis, Leah, Esperanza, and then Salvador. Thank you.
Buenos días. Hace 5 años estuve aquí en este salón de prensa para denunciar la denuncia administrativa que interpusimos al comisionado para la integridad de la Administración Pública de Canadá.
5 years ago, I was here in the press conference to announce a complaint we had filed with the Office of the Public Sector Integrity Commissioner of Canada.
En ella exigimos una investigación sobre las acciones y las omisiones de la Embajada canadiense en México, porque consideramos que aumentaron el peligro que corría mi padre Mariano Abarca.
In the complaint, we demanded an investigation into the actions and omissions of the Canadian Embassy in Mexico because we believe that the embassy increased the danger that my father, Mariano Abarca, faced.
Desde el 2008, mi padre inició una lucha junto con otros luchadores y luchadoras en el pueblo de Chicomuselo, Chiapas, para evitar que la empresa minera canadiense Blackfire contaminara el agua y la tierra por la explotación de varita.
Since 2008, my father was involved in a struggle alongside other community members in the town of Chicomuselo, Chiapas, to prevent the Canadian mining company, Blackfire, from contaminating our water and land through the mining of barite.
Sus luchas la desarrolló bajo amenazas y ataques que recibió tanto él como mi familia, incluyendo los golpes que ambos nos propinaron trabajadores de la empresa en el 2008. En agosto del 2009, Mariano fue detenido durante 8 días por acusaciones falsas interpuestas por un representante de la empresa y posteriormente fue asesinado el 27 de noviembre del 2009.
He took part in this movement while facing threats and attacks, both on a personal level and against his family, including a moment where we were both beaten by company workers in 2008. In August 2009, Mariano was detained for 8 days on false charges, on charge falses filed by a company representative. He was subsequently murdered on November 27, 2009.
Durante todo el tiempo que Blackfire operaba en Chicomuselo, la embajada tuvo un conocimiento significativo en el descontento de la población local con la empresa y también tuvo información sobre mi padre y los riesgos que éste enfrentaba.
During the time that Blackfire was operating in Chicomuselo, the embassy had significant knowledge of the local population's discontent with the company and also had information about my father and the risk he faced.
En documentos que nuestros aliados canadienses lograron obtener tras solicitudes bajo la ley de acceso a la información, pudimos darnos cuenta que la empresa consideraba esencial el apoyo de la embajada. En un correo al que pudimos acceder de la empresa a la embajada después de lograr un permiso de explosivos, dijo, no lo hubiéramos logrado sin su ayuda.
In documents that our Canadian allies were able to obtain following access to information requests, we were able to learn that the company considered the embassy's support essential. In an email we accessed from the company to the embassy after the company secured its explosive permit, it said, "We could not have done it without your help."
Al venir a presentar nuestra denuncia en Canadá, nuestras expectativas eran que las autoridades canadienses hubieran dado una respuesta favorable. Sin embargo, no nos hemos encontrado que aquí con la misma falta de voluntad y de seriedad para investigar el caso con que hemos topado en México, en donde vivimos en un contexto de impunidad para las empresas y quienes las apoyan.
In coming to Canada to file our complaint, we expected that Canadian authorities would give us a favorable response. However, we have encountered here the same lack of willingness and seriousness to investigate the case that we have encountered in Mexico, where we live in a context where companies and their supporters enjoy complete impunity.
Seguiremos buscando la justicia por lo que le pasó a mi papá y mi comunidad. También seguiremos buscando medidas de no repetición por otras personas y pueblos exigiendo y defendiendo la vida en donde hay inversiones mineras canadienses y en donde solamente se ha ido profundizando los riesgos de violencia durante estos últimos años.
We will continue to seek justice for what happened to my father and my community. We will also continue to seek measures of non-repetition for other people and indigenous communities, protecting life and demanding their rights be respected with regards to Canadian mining investments. And here, the risk of violence have only deepened in recent years.
Por tanto, no nos queda otra opción que llevar nuestra denuncia a la Comisión Interamericana de Derechos Humanos, en donde esperemos que tomen nuestras evidencias y argumentos en serio para establecer la responsabilidad que tiene Canadá por su apoyo no restringido a la codicia empresarial que nos sigue despojando y matando en México y otras partes del mundo.
Therefore, we have no other option but to take our complaint to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, where we hope the Commission will take our evidence and arguments seriously and establish Canada's responsibility for its unfettered support for corporate greed that continues to plunder and kill us in Mexico and other parts of the world.
Thank you, José Luis. I'll speak to the complaint itself. So we're bringing a case to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights because we believe Canada bears significant responsibility for what happened to Mr. Abarca and that Canada should be held responsible under international human rights law. As José Luis mentioned, access to information documents show that the Canadian Embassy in Mexico went out of its way to support the Payback mining project. The embassy also knew that leaders opposed to the project, like Mr. Abarca, were at risk. And this created an obligation on the embassy under international human rights law to help keep Mr. Abarca safe. Unfortunately, the embassy not only failed to help protect him, but actually increased the risk to his life. So, for example, the embassy offered the company a great deal of essential support without conducting any apparent human rights due diligence. The embassy continued in this support even when Mr. Abarca went to the embassy and told a representative directly that mine workers were threatening him and other community leaders. Not long after, the company made a criminal complaint against him, and Mexico detained him for 9 days without charge. The embassy received over 1,000 emails explaining who he was and expressing concern for his safety. While he was detained, the embassy forwarded an email to Mexican officials suggesting that groups associated with Mr. Abarca were planning a violent takeover of the mine site. About a month before he was murdered, when tensions were at their highest and the community was complaining about additional threats from armed mine workers, the embassy organized a delegation to Chiapas to pressure officials to continue to support the company and counter protests. A few weeks later, Mr. Abarca reported an additional threat to his life from a mine worker to Mexican police, and then he was murdered. We think this case shows, once again, that Canada's voluntary guidelines and mechanisms in support of human rights and corporate social responsibility don't work. They don't work for companies, and they don't work for Canadian officials either. So we hope the legal complaint will help push Canada to finally regulate the mining industry overseas through laws and mechanisms with teeth. Violence linked to Canadian mines in developing countries is widespread. It's been a problem for a long time. Successive governments have heard allegations of horror stories of violence at Canadian mines in developing countries, gang rape, torture, slavery, and in this case, yet another murder of a beloved community leader without any justice. So without stronger laws, Canadian officials will continue to be implicated in this violence, as the Abarca case shows. Thanks.
Buenas tardes. Mariano Abarca fue un fundador de la Red Mexicana de Afectadas y Afectados por la Minería. Desde su asesinato en 2009, la REMA ha acompañado a la familia en sus exigencias para la justicia, tanto en México como aquí en Canadá. Lamentamos estar aquí de vuelta en Ottawa, habiendo agotado los recursos jurídicos sin haber logrado una investigación sobre el rol de la Embajada canadiense en México, pero ha sido un proceso muy revelador.
Mariano Abarca was a founder of the Mexican network of people affected by mining, and since his murder in 2009, REMA has accompanied the family in their demands for justice both in Mexico and here in Canada. We regret being back here in Ottawa, having exhausted all legal challenges without achieving an investigation into the actions of the Canadian Embassy in Mexico. But it has been an eye-opening experience.
El asesinato de Mariano no significa algo inusual, aislado o accidental. Refleja fielmente un patrón de conducta que incorpora varios elementos de una política basada en el manejo y generación de conflictos mineros. Esto incluye la criminalización, el hostigamiento, las amenazas y campañas de desprestigio, la represión y el asesinato en contra de las y los defensores de la vida y el medio ambiente en los territorios afectados por esta actividad tan destructiva.
Mariano's murder was not unusual, isolated, or accidental. It reflects a pattern of behavior that incorporates the policy features based on the creation and management of mining-related conflicts. This includes criminalization, harassment, threats, and smear campaigns, repression and murder against defenders of life and the environment in the territories affected by this destructive activity.
Este patrón lleva años siendo aplicado en México y en toda América Latina, en donde intervienen empresas, los 3 niveles de gobierno, así también gobiernos como Canadá, a través de su embajada y su cuerpo diplomático para garantizar la inversión.
This pattern has been repeated for years in Mexico and throughout Latin America, where companies, all 3 levels of government, as well as governments such as Canada, through its embassy and diplomatic corps, all work to protect investment.
Contrario al discurso del gobierno canadiense en torno a los derechos humanos y la responsabilidad social empresarial, este caso demuestra el singular interés del gobierno de Canadá por promover y proteger el capital canadiense. En el curso de su revisión en las Cortes Federales, el gobierno se defendió argumentando que no son vinculantes sus compromisos con la vida de las y los defensores de derechos humanos.
Contrary to the Canadian government's discourse on human rights and corporate social responsibility, the case of Mariano reveals the Canadian government's sole interest in promoting and protecting Canadian capital. During the Federal Court of Appeal hearing, the Canadian government defended itself by arguing that its commitments to the lives of human rights defenders are not binding.
La poca seriedad y poca profundidad con la que se ha tratado este proceso revela además un desprecio, una gran falta de respeto hacia quienes sufren los daños de la industria minera, dando preferencia al enriquecimiento principalmente de unos pocos empresarios a costa de la vida, la sangre y la naturaleza de los pueblos.
The lack of consideration and depth with which this process has been treated reveals, moreover, a disdain and a great lack of respect for those who suffer the harms of the mining industry, prioritizing profits for a handful of companies at the expense of life and nature.
México es uno de los países más peligrosos para defender tierra y territorio, pero la promoción incondicional del gobierno canadiense para sus empresas mineras y el vacío de términos de prevención y procuración de justicia es especialmente grave ante la profundización de la violencia extrema en recientes años en México.
Mexico is already one of the most dangerous countries to be a land defender, but the Canadian government's unconditional promotion of its mining companies and the vacuum that exists when it comes to preventing harms and accessing justice is especially serious in light of the worsening levels of extreme violence seen in Mexico in recent years.
En partes del país que han visto una escala tremenda de asesinatos, desapariciones, desplazamiento forzado, se puede encontrar empresas mineras canadienses operando y expandiendo sus operaciones.
Canadian companies are operating and expanding in parts of the country that have seen a tremendous level of killings, disappearances, and forced displacements.
En tal contexto, La promoción diplomática de la inversión minera para la embajada, el Ministerio de Relaciones Exteriores o el mismo primer ministro, tal como lo hizo durante su visita a México a inicios de este año, magnifica nuestra impresión de que la vida en nuestros países del sur realmente no vale nada para este gobierno canadiense, mientras aún pueden seguir operando las empresas que se capitalizan en sus bolsas de valores.
In such a context, the diplomatic support and endorsement of mining investments by the embassy, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, or the Prime Minister himself, as he did during his visit to Mexico earlier this year, heightens the impression that life in our southern countries is worthless to the Canadian government, so long as companies that raise capital on Canadian stock markets can continue to operate.
Por todo esto, reafirmamos nuestro compromiso de continuar con este proceso ahora que se lleva a la Comisión Interamericana de Derechos Humanos, en donde esperamos lograr una respuesta que se dirija a algunos cambios de fondo que empiecen a remediar estas injusticias.
This is why we reiterate our firm commitment to continue on this with legal process, now taking it to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, where we hope to finally achieve a favorable resolution that would lead to fundamental changes that would be a start to remedy these injustices.
Gracias.
Good afternoon. My name is Salvador Herencia. I am the Director of the Human Rights Clinic of the Human Rights Research and Education Center at the University of Ottawa. Canada is a state member of the Organization of American States since 1990. And by that, it is bound to respect the inter-American human rights standards set by the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights and as established by the American Declaration on the Rights and Duties of Men. These are international obligations binding upon the government of Canada. The petition that will be filed in the next few days by Mr. Mariano Abarca's families and legal team focuses on the breach of the rights to life, personal integrity, access to justice, and freedom of speech. These are serious allegations that we have seen that both in the Canadian context and the Mexican context, Mr. Mariano Abarca has failed to receive proper justice and remediation to what happened and why he's no longer with us. The Inter-American Commission on Human Rights in the past decades has established its legally binding standards regarding business and human rights, regarding the protection of human rights defenders and environmental defenders. As my colleague already mentioned, Mexico is one of the most dangerous places in the world to be a human rights defender or an indigenous defender or a women's rights defender. The petition looks not only for the possibility of Mr. Abarca's family to get some redress and justice, but gives the chance for this type of situations never to happen again. That is why we hope that once this petition is admitted by the Commission might recommend or should recommend Canada to adopt legislation and policies to prevent Canadian mining companies and other companies operating abroad to affect the rights of peoples and communities like what happened in Chiapas in 2008. That is why we hope that the Inter-American Commission recommends Canada to adopt, among other things, a due diligence legislation applicable to all Canadian companies operating abroad, but in addition to that, to have a government body that has full investigative powers to investigate and bring to justice, if necessary, Canadian mining companies or all the other companies operating abroad and that are affecting human rights. That is the relevance of the Inter-American human rights system, and that is the relevance of the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights. Not only to bring justice to Mr. Mariano Abarca's families, but for Canada to adopt laws and policies so that this never happens again. Thank you very much.
We'll now start the question period. We'll, as usual, one question and one follow-up. We'll start with a question in the room, if there are any, and then we'll move on to Zoom. On Zoom, I invite you to use the raise hand function if you have a question.
My apologies for coming late. There's a lot going on today, but I was hoping that this isn't so much of a question as a request for possibly some questions tomorrow when I am not as busy, but I would also love to take a couple photos if folks have a few quick minutes after, because I'll probably be a bit delayed on this, and I'll be listening back so that I can ask you better questions after seeing the whole press conference. Thank you.
Are there any questions on Zoom? Please raise your use the raise hand function. No question on Zoom, so that will conclude the press conference. Thank you very much.